Welcome, everybody. This is an Engage Teacher Network webinar to give you some advice and answer your questions that you might have about the Kickstart grants. My name's Susan, and I'm one of the managers in the education team here at the British Science Association. So the Kickstart grants are provided by the British Science Association. We're a charity, and we're supported by UK Research and Innovation, UKRI, to offer these grants. They're specifically for schools in challenging circumstances, so that schools can organize their own activities and events during the week. The grant scheme is specifically aiming to engage children and young people who might not otherwise choose to participate in science, and also to promote cross-curricular learning. So we'll come back to those themes as we talk about some of the eligibility and priorities that we have about awarding the grants. This year, the Kickstart grants are £400. So if you have a previous history with the Kickstart grants, they have changed value over the years, but same as last year, a Kickstart grant is £400. So let's start with some simple ABCs about applying for a Kickstart grant. First and foremost, the A, are you eligible? So before applying, please ensure that you meet all the grant eligibility criteria. It is an application of several pages, so we don't want to waste your time. If you're not eligible for the grant, it's best not to invest in the application. And I will be going through in detail what those eligibility criteria are. Secondly, we need to think about the British Science Association priorities. So once you've established that your school or your setting is eligible, we'll also need to think about your plans, what you're planning for British Science Week. Do those plans meet our priorities? There are particular things that we're encouraging schools to do and that we want to focus our funding on. And again, I'll talk about those in more detail. We'll help you think about what those priorities are and what we need you to tell us about your plans so that we understand how you're meeting those priorities. And then finally, we're hoping that you can share with us clear and credible plans. So I would also add the third C, concise, to this section. Submit a concise application with clearly articulated plans and a realistic budget. Identify which activities you require funding for and any other funding you've secured from other sources. And we'll unpack that a little bit further. There are several sections in the Kickstart application where you have a text box of many words. I think the longest is 600 words. You are not obliged to fill that box. If your plans can be described in less, please do so. There are no awards just for filling the number of word counts. And we say this, and I'll repeat it later, every single Kickstart grant is reviewed by a person at the British Science Association. So as concise and clear that you can make that for the people at the other end reviewing that, we'll always appreciate that. Okay, so let's look at these in a little bit more detail. Let's start with eligibility. But before moving on to that, there is some important news for 2026. And particularly if you've applied before, want to draw attention to these things about the grant program this year in particular. We have fewer grants to award. So we haven't been funded to the same degree by UKRI as in previous years. So Kickstart will be even more competitive this year than it has been in previous years. Consequently, we're going to prioritize applications from schools that have not been funded before. So right from the top, if you know that your school received a Kickstart grant last year, the year before, even 3 years before, it is probably not worth your effort to apply. It will be in exceptional or extenuating circumstances where we would decide to provide a school this year with Kickstart when they have previously got a Kickstart grant. This year, we're really focusing on trying to support schools and settings that have not received funding from us before. We have a much shorter application window this year. So whereas there might have been, I think, 7 weeks normally to apply, there are only 4 weeks. So it's great that you're here. There's still until the 24th of November. That's next Monday at 5 p.m. to apply. Similarly, because we've launched a little later this year than we have in the past, typically we aimed to let schools know before the Christmas break whether or not they'd been successful in their application. That's unlikely this year. It's going to be January before we're able to let you know. And we will be paying out the grant to successful applicants before British Science Week, but perhaps not many months before British Science Week. So you need to be thinking about that in your plans, that you will have this uncertainty about whether or not you've been successful for funding until very close to January. So I hope that's helpful. Let's talk about eligibility. So you're eligible for a Kickstart grant if your school meets the following criteria. And the first is that you must be a school, college, or Ofsted registered early years, nursery, or preschool. The school or setting must be in England, Wales, Scotland, or Northern Ireland, and the school must be state funded. The only exception to that are registered independent special schools and registered alternative provision settings that receive local authority funding for pupil places. So these will have to be settings that are registered with whatever the nation's independent authority is, whether that's Estrin in Wales or Ofsted. Those are the only exceptions. The school can't be academically selective. The young people that you're aiming to run the activity or event for are aged between 3 and 19. And at least one of these additional eligibility criteria are met. So the first is that a minimum of 30% of your pupils are eligible for free school meals or the equivalent. And that doesn't include where free school meals are provided as standard as part of a universal policy. So this is specifically those students by way of economic disadvantage are eligible for free school meals. In Scotland, the equivalent is a minimum of 30% of pupils in quintile 1. And in England, you can use the pupil premium, sorry, a bit of a tongue twister, as the equivalent. Or a minimum of 30% of your pupils are from ethnic minority backgrounds, or the school is based in a remote and rural location. And on the application and on the website, there's a link where you can check your postcode to determine whether that's the case. So those are, sorry, I went past kind of quickly. Those are the eligibility criteria for your school. So is your school eligible? That's the A of our ABCs. And if your school or setting meets all of these eligibility criteria, that's tick in the box for the first thing. The B then moves us on to, are your plans eligible? Do you meet the priorities that the British Science Association has for funding Kickstart? And let's take a look at that. So the events or activities that you're planning for British Science Week, those that align most clearly with our priorities are those that were most likely to be funded. So that includes specifically supporting and targeting the young people that we consider to be underrepresented in STEM to take part. So those will be the children that are supported by free school meals from ethnic minority backgrounds, with special educational needs or disabilities, or from any other groups of young people more likely to be underrepresented in STEM. And that may be slightly different depending on your population, your local area, and if you have other groups, please do tell us about that. So for example, sometimes there are schools that are located where there are a lot of service families. Sometimes there are schools where there are a lot of families who are transient to the area, whether they're coming in and moving from refugee housing or elsewhere. You need to tell us about those specific circumstances if they are not already covered by the criteria that we talk about: free school meals, ethnic minority backgrounds, or SEND. Specifically, we want to support girls to develop their STEM skills, understandings, and passion. We're also targeting, as I said when we started, specifically to engage children who wouldn't normally choose to participate in STEM activities. So to linger here for a minute, an activity that's targeted at an after-school club that is a science club is not going to score as highly as an activity that is focusing on bringing whole year groups and whole classrooms into an activity, because the assumption would be the children who are part of the STEM club are already quite interested in science or STEM. And we would like that to be broadened to children who maybe are not so keen on science, that Science Week is a real opportunity to bring those children back into some excitement about science and get them thinking about STEM. We're also looking for plans that are embedded in your local community and involve the wider community as a core audience. And we mean wider than just the school community, so wider than just parents. What else can you do to connect with your local community, to help the young people in your school understand where science and engineering and maths and STEM is happening in their local community, how it's linked to their lives? We'd like to see plans that explicitly challenge stereotypes about science and STEM and make science relatable by connecting it to young people's personal experiences and interests, their local environment, and again, the community. So that might be building on what young people want to explore in terms of science and STEM. We love it when your plans give young people the opportunity to take the initiative and lead activities. So whether that's a council, whether that's young people demonstrating science activities or interventions, whether that's older children helping younger children, all those sorts of things are brilliant. We'd like to see some cross-curricular aspect to your plans and include your colleagues that are maybe not science teachers of science. Again, some of you will be secondary teachers, some of you will be primary teachers, which you're all teaching science, but that sort of linking science to other things can also help young people relate to it, particularly those young people that don't feel that science is for them. Raising awareness of diverse range of careers that studying STEM subjects can lead to. And, this is another possible link to challenging stereotypes. So broadening young people's understanding to what science can lead to, that it isn't just about wearing a lab coat or being an engineer at airline manufacturing, but tree surgeons or data scientists or all those other ways that science can lead and math can lead to different careers. And then finally, that have an impact on your activities throughout the year. So obviously, British Science Week is just 10 days, but we'd also like to see how are you building on it. So once you've had or leading up to your British Science Week activities, what else is going on that could maximize the momentum of a great British Science Week? So those are 10 priorities. We don't expect you to necessarily meet all of them. And we would rather you, in your application, develop where you're meeting some of them by explaining them in greater detail than just touching on each one of the 10. A richer will not say just, we are going to challenge stereotypes, but it will say how you're going to challenge stereotypes. And you won't necessarily have room to give us the details of how for all 10. So focus on describing quite well those that you're really doing some depth of planning on. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is just for a couple of examples, give you a little bit of a point of view from previous applications from other school applicants about what you might be doing to think about your plans and whether or not they meet our priorities. So the first one we'll take a look at is priority 3, engaging children who wouldn't normally choose to participate in STEM. So some of the questions you might want to be thinking about or answering as you're planning your activities are things like this. How are the less engaged pupils or those with lower prior attainment going to be supported? So you're running a big, exciting science week, but you have young people who aren't particularly keen in science. How are you going to engage them in the activity? If they're already, well, it's not really for me, I don't like science, I don't like math, you can tell us about the strategies that you're going to involve to specifically draw some of those young people in to make it feel like a place they do want to engage. Other questions. What accommodations are you going to make for your students with SEND? So what will need to be done to support young people with additional learning needs on the spectrum to take part? What are you going to do to make sure that it's a welcoming and supportive environment for them? And again, in another example, how are the girls in your school being proactively encouraged and engaged? So we know that girls are generally not as well represented in STEM careers and in some later study of STEM, so some biology is an exception. So how are the activities specifically addressing that? What's going to be planned and geared toward them to entice them to take part? And so I'm just going to reveal a couple of very short excerpts from previous applications. There won't be the whole application where we are demonstrating how the applicant has actually responded to some of those challenges. So here's a little blurb. Class teachers will choose activities that are best suited for their class to access, and adapted tasks will be created to ensure a suitable level of challenge for each pupil. So that's obviously recognizing that there are different abilities in the class and that the activities chosen will need to allow for that so that all those young people can feel part of the activity or achieve the goal, the award, whatever it might be. And then the second blurb, although there be a choice of activities, we've taken care to offer more that might appeal to girls. And the example, so this will be a set of activities that the school was planning, designing and creating shampoo bars, for example, to encourage take-up amongst the girls in the year. So specifically thinking about what's going to be more appealing to the girls to take part. Okay, the next one we're going to take a look at is the priority 5, challenging stereotypes about science. Again, some things to think about when planning. How can you connect the young people in your school with diverse STEM role models? How are you confronting the misconception that STEM is hard, masculine, or only for the innately clever? Third point, we'd just like to pause on for a minute, really encourage you to consider how offering prizes for top projects might actually be undermining and inadvertently reinforce the stereotype about science being only for the most clever. We'll talk a little bit about competition prizes a little bit later when we talk about budget as well. So some examples from previous applications. Several schools tell us about plans that involve parents. So they obtain a register, if you like, of what different parents and carers and family members do either as hobbies or as their job, and look at how to shine the light on how some of those careers and hobbies have an element of STEM. And so that young people can perhaps see that people doing science look like them, have accents like them, live in their community, live in their neighborhood. And that's a way of maybe challenging those stereotypes of scientists that they might otherwise encounter in the curriculum or on television or something like that. Another little quote there. Our children still have the view of science being old, gray-haired men and people in lab coats. And we'll challenge these stereotypes by making the activities cross-curricular and led by non-science teaching staff and members of the community. Again, so working on broadening, if in school the science teachers are seen as the science people, then maybe broadening that out with colleagues who are arts colleagues or history colleagues, delivering something that still has an aspect of science to it can broaden that understanding of how science interfaces with other subjects and what scientists might look like. Okay, so that's just a couple of examples. We're not going to do that for all 10 priorities, I'm afraid. The next thing we'll look at, which I mentioned briefly, is the budget. So you will be asked about the budget for your activities, and you're required to provide an outline to illustrate how the £400 of grant money will be used. Some things to consider when planning. First of all, is Kickstart the best funding for your plans? We know it's tough and that school budgets are quite limited, but sometimes we do get applications for things that don't meet our priorities, aren't really about Science Week, and it's best to invest your application time in other grants that are more appropriate for your needs if you're not looking for funding for British Science Week. Equally, if you have other sources of funding, please do tell us about those, and I'll explain why in a little bit more detail. Is your budget realistic? Will it stretch to the ambitions that you have? And ensure that all items in your budget have been included in the description of your plans. Those 3 points, if I just elaborate a little bit more, it is not uncommon to receive applications that talk about quite a number of activities that are planned, but then there's no indication of in the budget request how you're going to fund those things, or vice versa, that there are things in the budget that have not been mentioned otherwise in your plans. And that's really a problem for us to then understand what your plans really are and what you're asking for the funding for. So if you're running a big event, and we often see like full day drop down day where you're having a STEM fair and there's people coming in to deliver talks or do demonstrations or work with young people in the classroom. But then there's also after school things that are happening in the week running up or running after. And if all of those things are clear to require a budget that's more than £400, I think you need to tell us where the rest of the money is coming from. So if you've already secured funding from your PTA or equivalent, or there's already money in your science budget that's going to, pay for the refreshments for the visitors or pay for the travel to such and such a place you're visiting. Because if we have an application that doesn't tie up, we don't know how you're spending the grant money. So think carefully about where your plans are, what you need the money for, and be clear about where you've already got some resourcing available. Or, it could be kit or materials, you already have that, you're going to use recycled materials, etc. That's how we're going to understand better what your plans are. On the other hand, I'd like to point out, you don't need very detailed budgets with receipts or quotes from external providers. A bullet point list is fine. So an example budget from a previous grant application is not a massive amount of detail here, but we can clearly see, and obviously it relates to an application that's talking about planting things and some other games. But something like that with rough costs where you've thought about where you're investing that ties to your plans is fine. If we then continue on the budget and just talk about what Kickstart funding can be spent on and what it's not intended to be spent on. So first of all, here's the list. Most Kickstart funding is meant for equipment, materials, and consumables. So if you're running a whole school activity or projects across the week and then a science fair, you will probably need, poster board, beakers, things to plant, I don't know, cornstarch for building slime, all sorts of things. It tends to be quite a lot required for that. Sometimes there is also CPD for school staff. So particularly where you've got a science lead who wants to share some knowledge or train some other members of the staff to deliver activities, there might be CPD. There is occasionally field trips are possible on Kickstart Grant, speakers, presenters, or outreach shows. However, you see that I've starred that. We are unlikely to fund events where the budget is spent on a show or an external speaker. British Science Week is also about giving young people the opportunity to lead and connecting science to them personally. And we don't feel that just having someone come in and do a show meets that requirement or is the best expenditure of that investment to your school. So please do consider that. Kickstart funding cannot be used for large equipment, so investing in sort of capital equipment, if you like, laptops, microscopes, journal subscriptions, competition prizes for the reason I said before, salary costs, textbooks, or other equipment that would be required to deliver your normal curriculum, and costs already covered by other funding, and any costs associated with an event or activity that has already taken place. So not for something you've already done in term one, for example. This is about British Science Week. And we'd also prefer not to see more than £100 of the grant being spent on refreshments. Again, we know that British Science Week activities are also big dues at your school where you bring in families and members of the community and other speakers, and they need coffee and tea and biscuits, but please do keep in mind that the full grant is not meant to be spent on those refreshments in its entirety. Where we've talked about speakers and presenters, rather than speakers or presenters that you pay to come in, we'd also really encourage you to be thinking about the possibility of STEM ambassadors or other free visitors, members of your community that you could invite in and demonstrate that diversity in STEM, as we talked about before. Something also to consider about any visitors, presenters, or shows, please also think about how those visitors could inadvertently reinforce stereotypes about science just being for boffins or geniuses in lab coats. So thinking about that as well as one of our priorities is addressing those stereotypes. Also, when I mentioned trips and briefly touched earlier on about our hope that British Science Week is about connecting young people who are less engaged by science on a day-to-day basis, thinking about a trip for a group that is your STEM club or your STEM ambassadors or a hand-picked selection of young people that are particularly interested in science, again, is not going to be as attractive to us to fund as an activity that is reaching a wider group of young people who are not already heavily interested in science. So sometimes we'll get applications where there's a fantastic trip, great trip, but it is for a very selected group of already very science activated or young people with a high degree of science capital already. That's not going to be at the top of our list to fund. Okay, moving on. You're eligible, your school's eligible, you tick all the boxes about the school eligibility, you've got fantastic plans, you've really thought about all our priorities. Unfortunately, even if your school is eligible and your plans meet our priorities, we still might not be able to award you a grant. And here are some of the other things that are a factor in our decision making. If you've been awarded other support. So I mentioned at the outset that in this year in particular, if you have been funded by a Kickstart grant before, you are very unlikely to be awarded a grant, but we will also be looking at other support that you receive from the British Science Association. So if you are already in receipt of an Engage grant for CREST or a CREST kit box from this year, last year, that is something we are going to be taking account of. We have a limited number of grants to give out and we'd like to support as many schools as possible. If you've received a grant before and not met the terms and conditions, so for example, when you receive a grant, we ask that you participate in evaluation by doing feedback forms. If you haven't done that, that will be a factor in our decision making. We can only accept one application per school. So please do check with your colleagues or your senior leadership. What typically happens if two different teachers in different departments submit a grant, we will only take the last one that we receive and we will discount any that have come before that. And we won't assess it. So we won't even be looking at it. We'll only look at the one that's received last. So to save yourselves time, perhaps work with colleagues to do a joint application. We also aim for a broad geographical spread of grant-funded schools, and we may prioritize grants from one region over another. So we support schools in all 4 nations, and we'll be looking at a fair spread. And ultimately, as I said from the outset, there is a limited number of grants available, and that's fewer than there normally is for the Kickstart Grant Program, so it will be competitive. Okay, just a couple of other bits of advice about applying, and then we will take some questions. There's lots of information online, and we encourage you to read the FAQ before applying. So I haven't covered every possible question, but we have tried to draw together some typical questions in our frequently asked questions and encourage you to take a look at that. If you're using AI to assist you in writing your application, please be mindful that it is the unique circumstances of your school and your plans that we're interested in. We have seen an increase in applications that look like they've been supported with AI, and although it can be great to help you organize your answers, our reflection is that those applications are not clear about what makes the plans of your school unique. And that's really what we're looking for. So I've said here, ensure the how of your plans is clear. Maybe I should just explain that a little bit better. We talked a little bit about, I gave the example about smashing stereotypes or challenging stereotypes about STEM. A statement in an application that we're going to challenge stereotypes about STEM does not tell us how. So a good way to maybe challenge yourself if your plans are clear is with your statements or with each of our priorities, ensure that you've told us the how. So if you say, we're ensuring that all young people with special educational needs are going to be supported to take part, what's the how? How are you ensuring that? Is that with extra TA support? Is that with modified resources? Is that with kit or materials that is more appropriate for the challenges that those students have, whether those be pictorial demonstrations of an activity instruction or equipment that's been modified for use for children who have visual disabilities, etc. So really thinking about, have you told us the how? That's how we're going to understand what your plans are. And in our experience, that is where AI-assisted answers are weak. So just a bit of advice for that. Please check your bank account details and your school stats. By that, I mean you'll be asked for the percentage of young people in your school who are from ethnic minority groups, if you tick that as one of your eligibility criteria. And you will be asked what proportion of young people in your school are eligible for free school meals. So if you have someone in your office who provides those details, who records those statistics, please acquire that first. And similarly, please check with your finance contacts about the bank account details. It's very time consuming and can often mean that your grant is paid late if those details are not correct on your application. I have mentioned this before. Please check with your colleagues or your senior leadership team about what support your school has already received. You might not know that someone else in another department has already received a grant or some other support from the BSA. And we want to ensure that the time you spend on your application is well spent. We know it's time consuming, so your best place to be sure you're going to be eligible before applying. Be concise. Try not to repeat information. So as I said, there's a couple of boxes on the application where you've got some free text. Please ensure that the information you put in that box answers the question. So one question will say, what are your objectives? What are your plans? What are your budget? So the answer should go in the right box, and there's no need to repeat information across boxes, particularly if you feel like, well, I haven't filled the word count. You don't need to fill the word count if you've already described in another box what you're doing, then it doesn't need repeating. So that was a lot there. I'm going to take some questions. Karis, I don't know if you've already been answering questions in the chat. I haven't really been following the chat to any degree, but let me take a look now. Yes, the slides we will share. If we received a CREST award, not engaged, does that make us not eligible? No, a CREST award, so if your students have done CREST and you've submitted their work and you've got a CREST award, no, that's not financial support from the BSA. If you've received an Engage grant, so an Engage grant or simply CREST, that is financial support from the BSA to pay for your CREST award. So it wouldn't make you automatically ineligible, but if it's this year, it's very unlikely you're going to receive two different grants. So yes, if you have received Simply CREST this year, it's very unlikely that you'll receive a second load of financial support, if you like, in the form of a Kickstart grant. So simply because we have so much less support to give out, we really want to focus on making sure we spread that around fairly and we support schools who aren't already receiving some support from us. I didn't mention in the slides, but I hope you're all aware that there are free resources associated with British Science Week that you can download from the website. So we create an activity pack every year. Right now, what's the so-called taster pack is available, and that is then replaced by a fuller activity pack in early January, which has lots of activities that you can have a look at. And there's also a great set of resources called Smashing Stereotypes, which are profiles of individuals with cool jobs and hobbies in science and STEM that teachers often find useful to look at with their students, sometimes do little projects on those stereotype profiles, but they're all available online. So I've got a question from Haley in the chat, wanting children to choose their own mini project to run. How do I put funding? Because at this point, I wouldn't know exactly what materials they need. Yep, that's fine. We see a lot of that. I think what we would be looking for is some indication of how much you're allocating to different activities. So if the young people are doing projects, you may tell us that you've got 100 young people doing those projects, and they'll all have a budget of however much each, and so that's going to account for this much of the budget, and then there's going to be another £50 to have refreshments at the science fair. So as long as there's a bit of a sense of what you're putting in what pot, you may put some aside to support students with additional needs, etc. So no, we understand that you might not know exactly what the whole list is. And thank you, Karis, for adding some of those links to the British Science Week website. Oh yes, I forgot to mention the poster competition. Thank you. There'll be more information about the poster competition as well in January. We'll share that with you, but that's a great way to get the whole school involved. There's categories for every age group, and there'll be some brilliant new links to some fantastic research at UCL this year, a poster competition. And we always get some great prizes. If you've got time, there's also on the website some case studies of schools that have done things in the past. Gives you a bit of a flavor for what might be possible, what you think might work at your school. You're probably aware of the CREST Awards, and that's another program here at the British Science Association. Lots of interesting ways to involve the CREST Awards in your British Science Week activities. So you could take a look at the CREST website. There's a rather impressive list of resources that are available for all different age groups, with lots of activities that you could do on a drop-down day if you were having a day of science. Also some longer term projects that you may be able to work into your British Science Week activities as well. So thank you for attending. If you think of something after the fact, or you get halfway through planning your application before next Monday and want to check in, you can use that email address on the screen, or also we are mostly the same team, the CREST at BritishScienceAssociation.org as well.